Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the final webinar in the series covering the work of the Electric Vehicle Energy Taskforce over the last year. Today, we're going to be focusing on our work around consumer engagement. And before, we've got a great range of panelists who are experts in their own field who are going to be taking us through some of their work. But before we want to do that, I just want to do a brief introduction and to lay out the agenda for this afternoon. Okay, so we're going to be talking today about the EV Energy Task Force focused work on consumer engagement. As part of that, the agenda today is going to be focusing around, I'm going to be providing a brief introduction to the EV Energy Task Force and where we've got to date. We'll then be handing over to Tom Bullard, who's kindly stepped in at very short notice to for a colleague to take us through the work on improving the consumer complaints journey from Citizens Advice. We're also going to have a presentation from REA Limited on consumer information services for smart charging. We'll then be turning to our two resident consumer behavioural specialists, who both are aptly named Stephen O'Neill from Ofgem, who's going to be looking at consumer charging behaviour, and Stephen Skippon from the Energy Systems Catapult, who's going to be taking us through segmentation of the consumer market and how that might be broken down. And that will lead us up to a presentation from my colleague at Zemo Partnership, Jason Doran, who's going to be looking at what we can glean from that in terms of a campaign to encourage smart charging. And that's going to be vital, ensuring that we get the most out of the energy system as we move to a mass market for EVs. We'll be questions and answers we will be dealing with at the end, but we're asking people to submit their questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom. Please put them in as we go through the meeting, and when we get to the end, we'll be selecting those questions and posing those to the panel. Okay, before we delve into the detail of the presentation, I'd just like to, as Jonathan Murray, Policy and Operations Director at the Zemo Partnership. Zemo Partnership, you may have previously heard of us as the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership, acts as the coordinator for the EV Energy Task Force since its inception in 2018. We formed it at the request of government, and the objective was to ensure, initially was to ensure that the energy network wasn't a blocker to the mass uptake of electric vehicles in the coming decade. We put on it our own focus, which we strongly believe is around delivering benefits to the consumer, the EV driver, but also to benefits to the electricity bill payer as well. And yeah, our perspective has always been that unless you can engage and provide a positive experience for the EV driver, then we're not going to deliver on our potential in the transport sector through decarbonisation and meeting net zero. The original EV Energy Task Force produced a report back in January 2020, which set out 21 proposals across 5 themes. Key themes which were necessary to ensure that we were able to deliver a system, a minimum viable system that could cope with the mass uptake of EVs. And this is about the energy system, it's about the charging infrastructure, it's about the experience of charging, and how you get information as a consumer, and also how that system works together, whether it is data, whether it is standards. But all of this is driven by a need to deliver benefits to the consumer. Across our 5 themes, you'll see that the consumer benefits are at the heart of it, whether it be interoperability in theme 1, whether it is about rewarding consumers through smart charging, the ability to smart charge, rewarding people to use renewable energy, whether it is about data and data protection for better outcomes for consumers, or winning consumers' trust and confidence, or developing the charging infrastructure the consumer needs. We looked at this and we looked at the time frame that was needed to deliver that, and they were quite tight timescales. As you can see, to deliver something that is a functional system ready for what is now the objective for phasing out the sale of internal combustion engines as of 2030, with PEVs being phased out by 2035. So our proposals came ahead of that ambition from government, but we're still confident that our proposals would deliver against the ambition for phase out of internal combustion engines. The original report was very well received by government and industry, and so the task force was asked to continue its role in terms of identifying how, monitoring that EV charging landscape, identifying how proposals were being taken forward, where it was being delivered, where things were, where there were stakeholders who were delivering aspects of it that needed support, or where there were gaps that needed to be fulfilled. And so we took an exercise last year in terms of identifying where priority actions needed to take place to ensure that we were moving ahead apace, working in conjunction with BEIS and the energy team, working in conjunction with the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, working in conjunction with industry across the different sectors, whether it is automotive, charge points, energy sector, and indeed representatives of the consumers. We identified a number of areas where we felt action wasn't being taken and taken fast enough. And that led to 4 working groups being established to identify what could be done and what needed to be done in those specific areas. And they focused around guidance for local authorities. They focused around the data requirements for a smart energy system, a smart charge point, and a smart EV to allow decisions to be made. They focused around technical standards and cybersecurity, and what we're going to be talking about today, consumer engagement. Engaging consumers. Working Group 2 was established to focus on this, and as part of that, we undertook to look at what was needed to help engage and win consumers' trust and confidence. And the focused elements that we undertook to look at, that we felt that hadn't yet been established well enough, was to look at what if is required to deliver smart charging, whether we needed a campaign, what a campaign about smart charging might look like. Information services, what information is needed to encourage people to answer people's questions about smart charging, and also about complaint handling standards across the EV sector. And so that is what we dealt with, and that is what we're going to be addressing through today's presentations. And so at this point, I'm now going to pass it over to our next speaker, who is Tom Brooke Bullard from Citizens Advice, who's a policy researcher there and has stepped in today. And I think we should note that today is Clean Air Day, and what an apt day to be talking about electrifying vehicles. And Thomas is going to take us through work that we've been doing, looking at the complaints journey and the experience of consumers. So Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, as Jonathan said, this presentation was initially going to be presented by my colleague Rachel Mills, but unfortunately she's unwell today, so I'll be stepping in. I'm fairly close to the work, so hopefully I can answer any questions you guys have had, but Bridget Phelps from EVA England, who's very close to all of this work, will be involved in the Q&A as well, so she can hopefully pick up anything that I'm not able to answer, and I'm also happy to take away any questions and get back to you all. So as Jonathan said, this slide covers sort of the aims of this strand of work, which came out of EVET 1 and shaped the work that we did in this group. So if we move on to the second slide. So this is the sort of aims that shaped a lot of what we did within the group, and we can sort of think of it as a sort of ideal customer journey. So what would the customer journey look like if, what are we aiming for as an ideal customer journey, and then using that as a starting point to work towards. So that would be ensuring that appropriate information and protections are in place to minimize the number of problems people have. If a problem occurs, people can easily have that problem solved. And it would also mean that it's clear which organizations have responsibility for resolving a problem. It's easy for people to understand their rights, and that there is a seamless and timely journey to redress. So that's what we're aiming for. And if we go on to the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit about our approach to sort of understanding that customer journey a bit more, and understanding what a good customer journey would look like. So we began by approaching 11 organizations or representatives of those organizations to request data on the types of problems that people experience. From that work, 4 organizations, including Citizen Device ourselves, shared data about the types of problems that people were being contacted about with EVs. And one organization shared some extensive consumer research that they'd collected, while another offered to support this work through focus groups. Since the data that we collected wasn't sort of quantity that we could make significant quantitative conclusions, what we decided to do was use the data to create 9 scenarios that captured the broad themes of issues observed in this data, and we'll talk a little bit more about those themes in a minute. And we then conducted 3 workshops that were then used to assess how the complaints journey could be improved. The first of which was on the 3rd of March 2021, and then we conducted another one later on in March, and then another one in June as well. And we tested those processes with scenarios and stakeholders. So if we go on to the next slide, and we can talk a little bit more in detail about the kinds of themes which came up, particularly in that data collection exercise, and then as we sort of talked through those scenarios. I'm not going to run through all of these, but we can sort of highlight a few ones which were fairly common. So ones like sales related problems, that could often be related to the car itself or the charger, and that could be mis-selling or a perception of mis-selling around the range of a battery or about car performance. We also increasingly seeing issues around billing problems in relation to EV tariffs or cars or things like that. A fairly large number were just people asking questions, people who are confused about certain processes around buying EVs or EV tariffs or chargers and things like that. And then installation problems were another fairly common issue that we came across as well. If we head on to the next slide. So as I said, based on that data that we collected, we created 9 scenarios, which we decided to work through in the workshops. And these were mostly based on real world, of course, anonymized examples that we'd come across. But one or two, I think it was 2, were based on anticipated problems that may be more difficult to deliver redress for. So that was trying to sort of think about complicated problems that might occur in the future that we want to anticipate and work out a customer journey for. And there are more details of those in the slides, so you can contact me if you want more detail about the scenarios that we used. Next slide, please. This is one of the 9 example scenarios. So I'll just run through this quickly. This is sort of an example. Of somebody having an issue. This is sort of kind of example where which we might be seeing more of, which is where a piece of kit is sort of found to no longer work. It becomes sort of out of date. So the consumer bought a charging unit with a public charging subscription combined, but they found the charging unit was installed in the property could cost them a lot of money to upgrade to a 3-phase supply, and they wanted to refund the value of the additional cost or to exit the contract. So that's a sort of complicated issue and covers a lot of issues around things like being locked into unsuitable contracts. And then if we move on to the next slide. This one is this issue is around consumer being given poor information about a car before they buy the car, and it also speaks to the sort of the information that's necessary for consumers who often don't have a lot of information about EVs before they take them up, and how much they sort of rely on good information from dealerships and things like that. So this consumer was promised a car that had a 6.6 kilowatt charging speed, but found out after the purchase that it in fact didn't meet that minimum charging speed. So this slide is just the next 2 slides are just talking through the sort of structure of the first workshop that we did. So as I said, we brought together a number of stakeholders working in the EV space, and particularly in the sort of EV advice and redress space. And we began by identifying the kind of problems that that people have, and mapping that along the experience that people would have in dealing with those problems. And then feeding from that, we designed a sort of what we would see as an improved complaints handling and redress process. And if we look at some of the sort of key problems identified, a big one was there being different regulatory standards for how to handle complaints across sort of different industries. Another was the lack of clear responsibility over who handled complaints, and particularly where that resulted in a cost for triaging a consumer's problem. People also had difficulty in understanding who was responsible for an issue, especially if it involved sort of your energy supply or your charger and your car. It's very difficult to sort of understand who's responsible. And that would often lead to people being bounced between different companies or redress providers. And people also were often unsure of who to turn for independent advice. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Other issues included a lack of consistent standards at call centres, too much information for people to understand, and very hard to sort of find that information all in one place. And that is an issue which is particularly acute for digitally excluded consumers. Not all companies offer a redress scheme, and especially if they're not part of a regulated sector. There were other barriers to redress, included needing to pay to access services or a long lead time into accessing redress, even if it was provided. Another sort of specific issue is around bundling products and services, and that can really complicate the redress process, especially if the problem and the responsibility is unclear at the beginning of the case as well. Move on to the next slide, please. So in the second and third workshops, we really moved to sort of testing the improved process with the different scenarios that we identified to try and sort of understand the real world implications of those. And as you would expect, some of the processes, some of the elements of the new process were affirmed during that, but there were also some additional points that were raised as well. So we sort of moved to working through that. And if I quickly run through some of the key findings, many problems would have been, this is a really key one actually, many problems would have been prevented if people had understood their rights and received appropriate information earlier, particularly before the point of sale. There's potential, another finding was that there was potential for innovation around data and diagnostics to remove complexity in the complaints and redress process. Another finding that sort of came through across, I would say, all of the scenarios was that wider consumer protections need to be strengthened around product safety and liability for things like smart charging. And this is a part of a wider conversation than just EVs. We also found a need for wider monitoring and evaluation for complaints handling and also voluntary or mandatory standards. Another sort of emerging issue is that there could potentially be higher risks in the second-hand market where fewer protections are afforded to people, particularly because a lot of those second-hand dealerships tend not to offer redress and selling on bundled services as well. If we can move to the next slide, please. Other findings that we found were the risks are greater for problems with installers who haven't signed up to a redress scheme, as you might expect. So perhaps responsibility for offering redress may need to be linked with functions or offers rather than just specific businesses. A lack of formal terms and conditions can place some people at risk and is something that might undermine clarity and where people can go to for redress. Another possibility is that bundling providers should check the adequacy of offering their bundle for people, as there are a number of technical barriers that prevent full uptake. So yeah, that's a real whistle-stop tour of the key findings. And sorry, that was a bit sort of reading through that rather quickly, as I'm rather new to these slides. But if we move to the last slide, we can just talk through the next steps from this piece of work very quickly. So the first is obviously to write up the findings as part of the wider EVETS report with the other strands. And then something that we'd really like to do is consider further conversations with specific providers to try and understand the impact of these findings on them. Although we did that, though a lot of those providers were included in the workshops as well, but it'd be great to have sort of more detailed conversations to work through that. And we also want to gain feedback on these user requirements from EV drivers, and the plan is to do that through a workshop with EVA members. And then the hope is to use this to move out, to map out what each requirement would look like in more detail, and for that to feed into Bailey's work on reviewing consumer protections in this sector. Great, that is everything from me. So yeah, thanks again, and if you've got any questions, we'll be glad to answer them.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. That was really helpful, and also thank you for stepping in at such short notice to present the work that Citizens Advice has been leading with other members around the complaints user journey. We will now pass over to Lorraine Haskell, who is from the Renewable Energy Assurance Limited. And I think make that absolutely clear, because I think I made a misspoke earlier. And Lorraine is going to be talking about the provision of information to help ensure that consumers get the information they need to make informed decisions. So Lorraine, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'll just start my presentation. So I'm Lorraine Haskell. I'm from the Electric Vehicle Consumer Code for Home Charge Points, or EVCC. EVCC is a code of standards for installers of domestic charge points. We're there to promote high standards of consumer protection. Now, this work actually was led by the Energy Saving Trust, but I'll be presenting it today. The scope of this work was to identify sources of information available for consumers on electric vehicles and electric vehicle charge points, and also assess the quality of this information to ensure that consumers receive consistent quality information and can make informed choices. Now, in assessing the quality of the information, the groups first had to identify the information that was relevant and already available to consumers, and conduct market and touchpoint analysis with specific stakeholders. Once we had found this information, the quality of it needed to be assessed to see if it was adequate, and where it wasn't adequate, what was needed instead. For example, were there areas in particular that did not have much coverage, that needed more coverage? This was a huge task, assessing all of the information that was out there on electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging. And so it was decided by the group to concentrate on charging only. In particular, and the research was broken down. Citizens Advice was tasked with looking into public charging. Myself for EVCC was tasked with looking at home charging, and the Energy Saving Task was looking at smart charging in particular, which did sort of duplicate and overlap a little bit with the home charging and public charging. We all tried to use the same methodology when carrying out our research to ensure some consistency of results. We first identified all the various touch points for a consumer. So we identified that these were exploring options when a consumer is starting out in their journey, then choosing a charger, the installation of it, using the charge point, switching goods, and end of life. So then we took these different touch points and then we broke them down further. We looked at what were the needs of the consumers, what did the consumers want to know. So we broke each of those sections down further, asking the various questions a consumer would have. We then looked at we did look mainly online, We looked mainly online at the information. We were aware that there were other touch points, like when a consumer buys an EV from a dealer, for example, but we felt that was hard to assess, so we did concentrate on online information. And we tried to consider what a consumer needed and wanted to know, and tried to consider new drivers and experienced drivers as well. So we tried to cover everything. So we first researched those resources we all knew about, and then came to the digging about. We each tried to get into the mindset of the consumer, looking online by searching various search terms a consumer might use, and seeing what results came up in the searches. We then clicked into these searches and into the sites and analysed the information that was there, making a note of what was good, what was covered, and what was missing. Now, this is a spreadsheet of, this is an example of one of the spreadsheets, actually my own. So you can see how the information was set out, how the research was set out. You can see on the left-hand side, the touch points that I mentioned earlier, broken down. And then the information requirements, these touch points broken down further. In the middle, you can see the various websites that we found that came up in the top searches, and which each of these covered. Sorry about that. so what information each of these covered. We captured which search terms were used. We captured what the top internet searches were, so what pages came up highest in Google. We looked at the different tools that were available online to help consumers make choices about these different areas. And we looked at where there were gaps, what was missing. So this is a little bit on the search terms. So we actually used Google Trends to make sure that we were thinking about and searching the terms that a consumer would use. So for example, whereas a lot of people in the industry might use electric vehicle, Google Trends actually tells us a lot of consumers actually search the term electric car. Another example, home charge points we might use, but a lot of consumers, a lot of people searching for information online would use the term home charger. So by making sure we were using the relevant terms, we were coming up with the same information that a consumer would be coming up with, and we could then assess properly what the consumer was seeing. So here are the results. So as you can see, public charging, we thought there was medium coverage. On home charging, we thought there was good coverage. And on smart charging, there was poor coverage. This page also shows where the various top hits, the top pages that came up in Google searches on these subjects, and then also what they were covering. Finally, the gap analysis. So for public charging, what we felt was missing was information on public charging costs, customer service, reporting problems, bundled offers and roaming. For home charging, what was missing was charging for tenants if you're in a rental property, flats, if you don't have off-street parking. The installation process, what qualifications installers need, what data usage when there needs to be software updates, how is your data used, and also what to do when things go wrong, I'd say. And on smart charging, what was missing was independent advice, sort of the full explanation and benefits of smart charging, what equipment was needed, tariffs, cost savings, environmental benefits, and social benefits as well. So overall, we felt like the information was very varied in quality. There was a lot of information out there, but it was very fragmented and very bitty, and the quality of it was actually quite questionable. I also felt that the consumer, I had to do a lot of digging about, and as did the others. And so we felt like the consumer, to find the information, would they do as much digging about, as much research? Probably not. So there needed to be something immediate, more obvious for them, which they could rely on, which they could trust, and presented all of the information. The results also brought up a lot of websites from manufacturers or energy suppliers or installers, which had a lot of information on, a lot of general information on. And that information may well have been very good information, but obviously they are not neutral sites. They're not unbiased. They are trying to sell something. So we felt like there needed to be a neutral site that had this information on that a consumer could trust. There was also a lack of a glossary or explanations of terminology. A lot of jargon was used that we felt consumers probably might not understand. So there needs to be consistent language that's familiar with consumers. And overall, a consumer needs to know where to go for customer service, where they can educate themselves on electric vehicles and charging, how they can then feel confident to make informed choices, and what to do when things go wrong. finally, there was a big lack of information around switching, upgrades, and end of life, which might be because the industry is very new and these things haven't been thought about, though they obviously should be. So that's it from myself. Thanks very much. If you've got any questions, you can see a bit more information about EVCC here or drop me an email. Be happy to answer them or later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. That's a very comprehensive presentation on the work, and I have to say that having gone through the findings and the material that you guys analysed, it was really comprehensive and very useful in terms of looking at how information was used, and in particular, sort of what terms people use, particularly in terms of Google searches, etc. So, got a few questions coming in. Please do post any questions you have to the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get round to those when we get to the end of the presentations. In the meantime, I'd like to now pass over to our next presenter, Stephen O'Neill, who's a behavioural analyst expert at working for Ofgem. And Stephen's going to be looking at consumer behaviour around charging. So, Stephen, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. So I will just share my screen at the moment, and hopefully that is coming through to you. So, as Jonathan said, I'm Stephen O'Neill. I work in Ofgem, and I led a review of consumer research into charging behaviour for the working group. So the aim of the review was quite simple. It was just to summarise what has been learned from consumer research into how people charge their electric vehicles. So this is obviously quite a fast moving area. So one output of this review was a repository that we intend to keep as a living document going forward beyond the work of this working group that ideally different industry players can add to, so that we have a one-stop shop for consumer research into charging behaviour. And so for this review, we looked at primarily research from Great Britain that focused on preferences, attitudes, and behaviours of consumers to do with electric vehicle charging. This was both quantitative and qualitative methodologies, so involved looking at results from randomised control trials and surveys on the quantitative side, and on the qualitative side, interviews, focus groups, and diary entries as well. And in terms of the scope, anything to do with public charging, and included in this definition of public charging was workplace charging, and domestic charging was also included, but anything to do with fleet charging was left out of this scope. So by necessity, I will give you a whistle-stop tour through the findings of this, and if you do have any questions afterwards, please do put them into the Q&A section, as Jonathan said. So first up is, where do EV users prefer, and where do they actually tend to charge their electric vehicles? So the overwhelming majority of EV users prefer and actually do charge predominantly at home. So this comes out of, the preferences come out of qualitative research, and also the multiple smart charging trials that are out there also indicate that the majority of energy consumed and majority of charging takes place at home. However, even with this strong preference, EV drivers do report charging outside the home as well, both in the workplace and at the public charging network. And that tends to be the vast majority of EV drivers who want to actually use the public network as well as charging at home. Just a caveat up front, in that the vast majority of EV drivers at the moment have the option of charging at home, and so it's perhaps unsurprising that their preferences and their attitudes come through substantially in this work. So we just have to be mindful that there will be in the future population a significant portion of people who don't actually have this option, and their preferences might differ. We'll go quickly through domestic charging and then move on to public charging. So with domestic charging, when do EV users actually tend to charge their electric vehicle? So the short answer is immediately after work in pre-COVID times, which is the peak energy usage time, and essentially is when it's most convenient for the user. So it's quite a habitual behavior charging at home, And evidence from our EV charging trials indicate that the most common plug-in time is immediately when people come home from work, so between 5 to 8 p.m. for current EV users. And this is mainly to do with the convenience factor. It is important to note here, and we'll come on to it when I speak about smart charging, that these findings indicate that EV users currently plug in their EV at the peak time. It does not necessarily follow that users need or even want the car to be charging at this time. And this can be seen more when we look at how frequently and for how long EV users actually plug in their electric vehicles. So there's quite a mixed outcomes when you look at how often EV users actually charge their vehicles. But the one study, in fact, actually shows that about 70% charge it daily. However, that is more of an aberration of a finding. The most common finding is that EV users charge their vehicles roughly 3 to 4 times per week. So this has come out in the qualitative research and also in the many smart charging trials that have taken place. And it's a very habitual behavior in that almost half of EV drivers charge at regular intervals, regardless of the state of the battery. Also interesting to me anyway to find is that EV users actually leave the vehicle plugged in for considerably longer than is necessary to charge it. So if we go back to the convenience factor, most EV users tend to plug in their electric vehicle and leave it plugged in until they next need to drive. Quite often this actually means that they plug in when returning from work and leave it plugged in overnight. And so in some of the charging trials, this has resulted in vehicles being plugged in for 5 times the length of the charging session. And that is particularly important due to the fact that that actually gives you an opportunity for smart charging if there's a lot more time that the car is plugged in than is actually charging. And just when interpreting these findings, it's worth being aware of that current EV drivers in quite a lot of the research tend not to be solely reliant on their EVs for transport. So it is possible that the frequency of charging will increase, most likely to increase as the EV becomes becomes more commonly the primary mode of transport in the home. And on smart charging, there was quite a bit of consumer research into smart charging. So this is very quick headline findings. We found that unprompted awareness of smart charging is generally quite low, but given this low awareness, consumer research by necessity has to explain what the concept is, and then once that is done, consumers actually tend to understand the concept and can identify peak energy times quite easily, particularly EV drivers. When it comes to attitudes towards smart charging, they're generally positive, particularly from EV drivers, but the willingness to get involved is conditional on perceived savings. And then when it comes to smart charging system, being on a smart charging system and how consumers actually respond, across multiple trials, there's been a significant reduction in peak demand when consumers have a smart charging system, between 50 to 80% reduction. And also, it seems that the vast majority of consumers don't actually override. In most of these trials, there's an override option or a boosting option, which means that you can charge now as opposed to waiting or to adhering to the default. And it seems that there's quite a low boosting rate in most of the trials, even though it goes up to 35% in some, but this tends to be driven by a small subset of users who override consistently rather than a large subset who just do it very, very rarely. And now I will go on to public charging. So the current EV users view the public charging network as obviously necessary, even with their strong preference for home charging, and it's particularly useful for longer journeys. The public charging infrastructure is cited quite often, mainly negatively, but sometimes positively in consumer research on uptake of electric vehicles. And it is worth noting that the public perception of the charging network in the UK is actually broadly negative, in that about 1 in 5 people are rating it as very or fairly good, and just over half are rating it as poor or very poor. There's, just to note, there is quite a difference between the regions of Britain. So it has come out in certain qualitative pieces of research that customers are generally happier with the network in Scotland than in England. And if we go on to the reasons for this negative perception on the next slide, it might highlight that further. So the broadly negative perception of the charging network is largely driven by the availability or perception of availability and accessibility of charge points, difficulties with the technology and with mobile apps, and also to do with the complicated price or the perceived complicated pricing of charge points. So one survey with around 26,000 UK motorists actually showed that 81% of motorists identify availability and accessibility of charge points as one of the two key issues alongside upfront EV cost as a barrier to uptake of EVs. So the fact that there's too many mobile apps needed and that charge points are complicated in terms of pricing is something that also comes out quite considerably during consumer research. And then finally, it's just worth noting that there are groups within society that for some of these issues will be more difficult. So as you can see with the line at the bottom, the Research Institute for Disabled Consumers have found that these issues, particularly availability and accessibility, are much more prevalent for disabled EV users. In the interest of time, I will not go into the summary as it's by definition a repeat of what's already happened. So I will go back to Jonathan and Stephen Skippon.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen, for that presentation. And some interesting sort of insights into behaviour around home charging, smart charging, the concept of smart charging, and the perception of public charging, which we can explore a bit more in the questions and answers. I see a few questions coming in that we can address later, but please do bring some more. One of the key questions I think is around accessibility, and that's that can be in a number of different forms, whether it's it's for the disabled community, or whether it's access to a charge point per se for anybody, or even the type of vehicle and the position of the charge point in a parking bay. We're now going to pass on to our second Stephen. Stephen Skippon from the Energy Systems Catapult who is really a true behavioural scientist expert. So Stephen, I'd like to pass over to you, and I think you were going to talk to us about potential segmentation of the market.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. So I'm going to talk about consumer segmentation and what kind of consumer segmentation information we have available at the moment that's relevant to the present UK market. When we're thinking about charging behaviour and when we're thinking about attitudes to smart charging. So consumer segmentation is the business of saying that not all consumers are the same, that people differ. And the idea is to try and cluster people into subgroups who have shared characteristics. If you don't believe that everybody's the same, then just think about people you know. You know, there's quite a wide diversity in people we know, and that maps over into things like attitudes to electric vehicles. So the little pie chart that's on this slide is the results of a segmentation study that was done some time ago as part of an ETI project. And in this picture, attitudes to electric vehicle adoption change as we go round the clock. So the thin green sliver is people who are very enthusiastic about electric vehicles, and when we go around to the kind of to the segment that's marked 7, image conscious rejectors, they're people who are very, very anti-electric vehicle. So this kind of study shows you that attitudes differ substantially, and we need to know that if we're developing customer value propositions, say for smart charging, we need to understand this kind of picture, how people segment in terms of their attitudes to smart charging. We also need to know it if we're going to model a potential development of a market, because different groups will have, say, different attitudes to smart charging. So we've been looking in in working group 2, in one workshop, in one work stream, at 2 kinds of topic where segmentation would be useful. The first is looking at charging behaviour. So Stephen O'Neill has talked about charging behaviour in a sort of general way, and lots of the studies have lots of the studies that have measured charging behaviour have aggregated data from lots of different people. What we're interested in this piece of literature review has been, have there been any studies that have segmented people's charging behaviour and identified different patterns in different groups? We've also been interested in whether or not people are willing to consider what attitudes do they have towards smart charging. I'll just briefly mention the method. Basically, we did this by looking for research articles using Google Scholar and Science Direct, using a set of relevant search terms, and also by inquiries among working group members, and also by directly emailing experts in the field. So I'm first going to talk about segmentation by charging behaviour. So this is segmenting people by how they behave in relation to charging. So how do they do charging, if you like? We only found one study that was relevant to the UK at the present time, and that's a study done by Delta EE in 2018, and they identified 3 sort of classes, segments of consumers, of which the biggest they're called suburban commuters, and these are people who could charge at home and at work, and basically they were looking for opportunities to charge that fitted around their regular schedule. Then there was another cluster, another segment which they referred to as mix and matchers. These tended to be people who used public charging rather more often than the suburban commuters did. And finally, there were the home dwellers who tended to live in more suburban and rural settings, and were less focused on getting the cheapest price, but they did tend to charge mostly at home. So they're the ones that use the public charging network the least. There's a number of limitations. I mean, any study has limitations, and so I'm going to mention the limitations of the studies that I talk about. For EVETS purposes, there were a couple of limitations to the Delta EE study. One was that it's a segmentation model for people who are interested in purchasing an EV within the next 5 years. So it's not necessarily representative of the way that the wider population of mainstream consumers might segment. The other thing that we noticed from the limited information that we had was that timing of charging was not included in this study, and that's a quite important variable in consumer charging behaviour. The study was mostly focused on where people would charge. The other limitation for some potential users of this study is that the full model is only available on a subscription basis. It's not published in the open literature. Okay, now I'm going to talk about segmentation by attitudes to smart charging, and we found 2 studies that were relevant here. The first one was a segmentation model that was produced in the CVI, the ETI's CVI study, the Consumers, Vehicles and Energy Integration Study. They did a piece of qualitative research early on in the CVI project with existing users of electric vehicles. And in order to explain their qualitative data, they proposed this segmentation model, which suggests that people segment in relation to kind of 2 different dimensions, really. The first of which was was the strength of preference they had for simplicity of use. And the second was the strength of preference they had for personal control. So if you look at the two dots here, the big blue dot represents what in CVI was called user managed charging, and might be more familiar to people as time of use charging. So that's where where the supplier sets a variable tariff and charges less at times when the supply-demand balance is most optimal. So a user-managed charging proposition addresses consumers who have a strong preference for personal control, but aren't that bothered about simplicity of use. On the other hand, a supplier-managed charging proposition, one that's one where the user hands over control of the timing of the charging to the supplier, who manages the timing to deliver a result to the consumer, which, for instance, might be to deliver the cheapest charging. That appeals to consumers who have a strong preference for simplicity, but less preference for personal control. So that's a proposed segmentation, but it as yet hasn't been tested. We did find one full-on segmentation study in relation to smart charging, which was done by Bailey and Axsen in Canada in 2015. So this was a large-scale survey with about 1,500 participants asked about their attitudes to smart charging. And they found 4 key segments. They're called smart charging utility control charging, UCC. So the segment that's called anti-UCC is people who are who responded negatively to smart charging. Interestingly, that's quite, that isn't a very big segment. It's less than a quarter of the sample. So all of the rest of the sample responded quite favourably to smart charging. The segment that's called charge focused, their main issue was that they required a guaranteed minimum charge, so that they'd be willing to give some control of of charging to the supplier, but within limits, so that the supplier would have to guarantee a certain amount of charge. Then there was a cost motivated segment. They were obviously primarily interested in low cost. They weren't interested in paying extra for a higher percentage of green energy. And in contrast to them, there was a renewable focused segment who were willing to pay extra for some sort of guarantee that their electricity would contain a higher percentage of green energy. Okay, so the overwhelming picture here is that there's very little segmentation information, and particularly in relation to smart charging, we don't have an up-to-date segmentation of attitudes to smart charging for the UK market. So one of our recommendations is that as a high priority, we should commission a segmentation study on public attitudes to smart charging, involving both existing and future EV users. Because we have the Delta EE model, a further segmentation for EV charging behaviour is a lower priority, but we still do need to have a segmentation model that addresses the whole consumer, addresses all prospective EV users going forward, and the Delta EE one is a little bit narrower than we'd like to see. Okay, so that's all I've got to say. If anybody is aware of any studies that we haven't found, and that might be particularly the case where studies have been done by commercial organisations that aren't in the open literature, we'd be more than pleased to hear from you. I would. And apart from that, I'd just like to say, if anybody has any questions, if you could pop them in the Q&A. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's really helpful. And I think we're sort of laying down the scene here of what we understand about the consumer landscape and the perceptions of that consumer landscape in terms of some of these features. And that's vitally important because, if we're going to make the most of our energy system in the UK as we roll out the mass uptake of EVs, it's going to put new demand on the network, and we want to be able to ensure that we're able to support that and supply that. And so smart charging is going to be vitally important. And also how to get that message across to consumers, but also to understand some of these perceptions around negativity. And we've all seen in the last year the impact that vaccine, the backlash against from some sectors about vaccines and the problems that has caused. And obviously, we need to be able to understand how to overcome that, how to address those issues as well. Couple of things that are coming up in the questions, which I'll just sort of flag up and sort of ask colleagues on the panel to start thinking about. What is it? What are the implications for different parts of the United Kingdom? Obviously, Great Britain, being England, Scotland and Wales, is one electricity network, which has been the main focus. And Northern Ireland is part of the Island of Ireland energy network. So there are differences, but any views around the knowledge of the Northern Ireland market. Also, some of the issues that we've been talking about, segmentation and information for and how that relates to accessibility and that important market, because because one of the key things that we have to ensure is equity. In terms of electrifying transport, we have to look for equitable solutions. And also questions around how technologies, hydrogen, and how that fits in, and also about rates of charging. Some of those questions are a bit technical. They might not be the right panel that we have here, but we'll bring our thoughts to bear as best we can on some of those. Right now, I think that's really sort of laid down the evidence base very well for our next presentation, which is going to be given by Jason Doran, who's a head of communications at the Zemo partnership, who's going to be talking about how we might address this and our thoughts about promotion of smart charging. Jason has a very good background in this, having worked for Nissan in their EV marketing for, I'm going to get this wrong now, aren't I? Chargemaster, which has obviously now been taken over and is now BP Pulse in the charging market, and also worked on the Go Ultra Low campaign. So I'm going to hand over to Jason now to take us through some of the thoughts about how you might take this evidence and form that into some lessons learned for developing a consumer campaign focused around smart charging. So Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was a very nice introduction. Good afternoon. Yeah, my name is Jason Doran. I'm head of marketing at Zemo Partnership. Let me just share the jolly old screen. So, considerations for a consumer smart charging campaign is what I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon. So yes, I'm going to talk about considerations for a smart charging campaign. A couple of key things just to point out at the start. Sorry to disappoint people, but this isn't an answer. We don't have a solution yet. This isn't a solution. Far from it. There's an awful lot more work to do, as I'm sure you can imagine, to get to that point. But this instead is key considerations when constructing and thinking about how we put this campaign together, that very much build upon the experiences and the work and the fantastic knowledge that this group have already demonstrated earlier in this presentation. So, you know, we're pulling all that together and using that to inform what we're doing with this campaign. I think it's also worth just bearing in mind that getting this campaign right, and therefore, you know, putting the resources and the effort and the time behind it is absolutely critical, because at the end of the day, we can do as much work in the background as we like about preparing the market and getting the country ready, you know, for the mass uptake of EVs. But if we don't tick the basic box, if we still don't make sure consumers know how to charge, you know that they can run an electric vehicle happily and economically themselves, this isn't going to happen. So we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that. And I'm not just saying that because it's the bit that I'm doing, it's just to try and show that it's going to need a lot of investment and attention to get all this right. So the first thing I want to do is just give a few sort of thought starters to try and set the scene. And sorry to disappoint you on the first one, but I think it's fair to say that really no one other than us particularly cares about all this, which might sound a bit extreme, but the problem is, particularly at the moment, let's face it, you know, consumers have got a lot of other things to worry about, or rather hope they might be doing. And that needs to be borne in mind when we put all this campaign together. Anything that makes this sound too hard, too complicated, too onerous, actually just risks derailing the whole thing. Not only turning people off to the whole idea of smart charging or charging in itself, but actually you could just stifle adoption of electric vehicles as well. So we need to make this easy for people to understand. And one of the key things actually that helps towards that is we shouldn't let the word smart confuse things. Most consumers, you know, it's either charging or it's not charging, and smart charging needs to become the default. It needs to become the habit. So we shouldn't really be talking about smart charging per se. It should just be charging which happens to be smart. And if you're charging in the right way, which is smart, then you're charging efficiently and economically and getting the best from your vehicle. So that's something that is certainly worth considering. I think we also need to think about the fact that, as I said here, there isn't a silver bullet, as in there isn't, you know, just one answer to all this. You know, there's an awful lot of components to make this all work. So a communication campaign, for example, if we're going to change behaviour, it can address the, if you like, the capability and motivational sides of it by giving people the awareness and the knowledge, making them understand why this behaviour is worthwhile. But they still need to have the time, the resources, the money, you know, the access to do it. So in this case, to do the smart charging. So we need all those boxes ticking before we change behaviour. So the point is, you know, it is a lot more than just a campaign. Everything needs to be in the right place for consumers to adopt the behaviours that we're wanting them to adopt. And it's also worth then thinking about what that means for behaviour. We need smart charging to become habit. You know, it needs to be something that people do without thinking about it. So again, through a campaign, there's some one-off behaviours that we can fairly easily influence. You know, we can get someone to adopt the right type of smart charging hardware. We can get them to adopt the right type of smart charging tariff or incentive product. But they're one-offs. But, you know, for it to work, they have then got to habitually smart charge so that it becomes their default behaviour, so that, as Stephen was saying earlier, when they come home from work and plug the vehicle in, they're plugging it in, setting it up for smart charge. They might have plugged it in at 5 o'clock, but they're quite happy for it to start charging at the right point, perhaps 2 or 3 in the morning, as and when the tariff and so on dictates. But for that to happen, we need to be constantly reminding people, because, you know, a one-off prompt doesn't turn something into a habit. So we need to find ways of communicating with people that reminds them on an ongoing basis that they need to be smart charging, until you get that sort of repetition going, build up a routine, and then it becomes habitual behaviour. So that is a key part of whatever we end up producing for a campaign as well. I think it's also, well, this picked up from what Stephen was saying a few moments ago, you know, let's not treat everyone the same. It sounds fairly basic, I suppose, but it's still worth bearing in mind, particularly in this market, because you've got the early adopters on the one hand, and some of them are very tech savvy and very enthusiastic and really are your true, you know, early adopters. And yet you have an awful lot of people out there who have very, very, very little knowledge about what an electric vehicle is. They probably think they should be choosing one. They might go and look at one at the dealership or look at one online, but they know precious little about it other than it's got a battery somewhere. So, you know, we should think about that. Let's not treat everyone the same, because they're going to have different requirements, different understandings. So that's a few sort of thought starters. If we now sort of home in on some of that, I think the first thing to think about is, okay, so taking all that into account, well, who are we talking to with this campaign? And I think really we've got to split this into, as I just said, into, you know, two key audiences. Now, the first of these would be existing drivers of electric vehicles who have a data-enabled home charge unit, because let's face it, if you haven't got one of those, if you bought one a long time ago, you're going to struggle to smart charge properly. So, you know, part of this is, let's go for the low-hanging fruit first. Let's go for someone who at least already drives an electric vehicle. They're an early adopter, so they like to be enthusiastic. They've got into a routine of charging, and they've got a home charge unit that will allow them smart charge. We also need them to have a smart meter, which again, might sound a little bit obvious, but it's surprising how many people still don't have smart meters, me included, actually, no matter how many times I ask. But that's another story. So that's in terms of, you know, that's okay, that's the existing drivers. We've also, of course, got another very large audience, which would be your first time EV considerers, as we call them. And these could be new or used. We shouldn't forget about the used market. As we all know, the sale of used cars is much higher in terms of volume than it is of new cars, even though we all tend to sort of focus on new cars when we're talking about these type of things. At once, you know, new car EV sales get to a point that there's a good volume of used EVs available, the number of used EVs being sold will far outstrip the number of new ones being sold. So, you know, we've got to consider audiences across all those markets. Now, in terms of what the characteristics of these guys, you know, they haven't got an electric vehicle, but they're probably a long way through the purchase decision-making process, and they may well be ordering soon. But they haven't, they don't know a huge amount. They're starting to think seriously about home charging, and they're starting to think about needing a different tariff, but they don't know the details. So this is the point where we need to be trying to talk to this audience. So in terms of, that's their characteristics, you like, but what do they currently think? And what would we like them to think? So I've split this up obviously into two audiences, into those two areas. Apologies, it's a little bit wordy, these slides, but I'll just pick out the key things. So, I mean, current EV drivers, okay, what do they currently think? Well, the good thing is you've all seen the various bits of research. By and large, I mean, not all, but the vast majority tend to love their EVs and do tend to become a bit of an EV bore. Now, from our point of view, that's a good thing, because that means they're going to bore people about how brilliant smart charging is as well, and that's great. As relatively early adopters of electric vehicles, they're also keen and happy to try something new, which is exactly what we want here. They're likely to be very happy with the low running costs. I mean, people always talk about the wonderful driving experience of EVs, but it's usually very quickly followed up by how cheap it is to run, particularly, you know, when you compare it with the diesel SUV they had before. In terms of smart charging, they're unlikely to know what it is, but can probably hazard a pretty good guess, because they're fairly savvy, these guys. As I say, they've already got an EV, they're into charging. But it is likely that they won't then know how to go about, you know, getting help and advice to begin smart charging. So what do we want them to think? Well, you know, I think it's that phrase at the top. You know, now I understand smart charging is, it makes perfect sense. That's exactly what we want them to think. And the whole idea that it really shouldn't make much of a difference to them, apart from giving them even bigger savings than before. They're the key things that we want to come out of this. I think it's also important because there's, although there are a huge number of benefits to people with smart charging, obviously one of the conditions, if you like, is that you might be able to, so you might not be able to charge exactly when you want. And so we need people to understand that and feel that's a fair value exchange, you know, in relation to the low costs they're paying by smart charging. I mean, overall, we want the outtake to be becoming a smart charger is so much easier than I thought. It used to be as easy as that. That's what we want people to think. In terms of our first time EV considerers, So what are they currently thinking? I think we can all probably sort of guess this. You know, they're very excited about the prospect of buying an EV, and they're absolutely terrified about the prospect of charging it. And I think a lot of that comes down to the horror stories that you continually see in the media, and the perception that the bloke down the pub told me. You know, the charging network, the public charging network, I would say, is not as bad as people make out, although it isn't perfect. And home charging, if you've got the right solution at home, is way, way easier than ever going to a petrol station again. But the point is, people don't get that. So, you know, it's not, we used to talk about range anxiety. I think now it's more charging anxiety. I think people have got a bit more used to the fact that the batteries are getting better, although don't get me wrong, there's always the guy who say you can't drive to Scotland. But I think overall it's charging anxiety, which is fueling the problem at the moment. So that's the key thing that is getting these first-time people concerned. And I think when they start to look into it, they end up with this, oh my goodness, this is getting really, really complicated. And I didn't realize this was that hard. You know, it isn't like this when I go and buy a petrol or a diesel car. Surely there is someone here who can help me. So I think that's the mindset these people are likely to be in. In terms of where we want to get them to, at last, this is starting to make sense. You know, this charging lark sounds okay to me. That's what we want to end up with. We want them to understand that actually this charging at home is easy. You know, this kit's really clever. It'll make sure they get the greenest, cheapest electricity available. They need to select a tariff, but then that's no different from changing their domestic tariff. And basically, it's a shame no one knew about this before, type of thing. You know, they didn't need to have worried. So it's giving that confidence and reassurance that the charging is not the barrier that you thought it was. So that's where we want to end up with them. So that's where we want to end up. But why should they care about this? What is the benefit to consumers of charging, as I'm going to call it? Well, for existing owners, you know, it's about giving them an even better value experience. A lot of them are getting great value already, but this is about giving them an even better value experience. It allows them to be seen as pioneers of the latest technology, and a lot of them like that. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of that to people. I think it's also the knowledge that it makes charging possible for all, because you do hear stories and you read it on the forums that you know, some of the guys who've been driving EVs for a while and they're seeing the charging points becoming more and more widely used do worry about how it's all going to be when everyone's driving an EV. And you know, I think also it maximizes people's use of renewable electricity, which people like to feel they are doing and have been able to do. For first-time buyers, or considerers, I should say, I mean, you know, the benefit is that we demystify charging, and we make them understand that this is easy and not a barrier. As I say to them, it's just demystifying charging. It's not smart charging in itself, because all charging should be smart. We also want to make sure we offer them the trusted help and advice that they need, and make them understand that, you know, there is great value, environmentally friendly charging available. And you know, they're benefits that people are always going to be happy if they can benefit from them. So I've rattled through that a little bit quickly, but if we just take all that together, so what does all that mean for a campaign? As I say, please don't get me wrong, this isn't an answer. This is just how we then might sort of start to shape and approach things. But obviously, there's a lot more work to be done before we can actually come up with what, you know, the campaign itself would be. But this, I guess, is just some initial thoughts about how we would perhaps start to think about tackling things. So, I mean, one of the key things to say, without sort of almost stepping backwards, we need to wait until the market's ready to do this properly, as in before talking to, when I say mass market, you know, talking to the wider, broader audience of those who would be first-time buyers. So we need the half-hourly settlements to be in place, which I understand is 2023. So that then leads us on to, you know, our recommendation is that we take a phased approach to all this. So phase one, which we can do a little earlier in 2022 perhaps. Now this would target the existing electric vehicle drivers, the ones who've already got the home charge unit I talked about. One of the advantages there is that get them behind smart charging, you could then use them as early adopter advocates of charging. And advocacy can be very, very powerful in changing you know, doubters' behaviour. So it's really important that we sort of tap into these advocates if we're able to. Phase two would then be when we go to the broader, first considering an EV audience, which I guess is likely to be 2023. Now, you know, the guys out of the budget will be pleased to hear that perhaps a big broadcast campaign isn't necessarily the answer here, although it certainly would help. I mean, don't get me wrong, but I think rather than a big broadcast campaign on its own, you know, what we need to be doing is raising awareness and prompting engagement into the idea of smart charging all the way through the customer journey, at all touch points, through all actors. And timing is key. You know, there's no point telling someone about it if they've just switched to a tariff that doesn't allow smart charging, for example, or they've had the wrong type of smart charge point installed for some reason. So, you know, it's very important we get the timing right. But this part of being there with the right information at the right point of the customer journey is really, really important. We also need to normalize smart charging so that it's just part and parcel of having an EV and not this horrible thing that I'm really frightened about and I won't be able to understand and it's putting me off buying it. It shouldn't really feel any different from, you know, when I buy a petrol or diesel car, I go to the petrol station and fill up. When I buy an electric vehicle, I have a charging unit at home that I use to charge. It gives me great value and it's really convenient. It just needs to be normalized. You do that by trying to embed the message about charging and the benefits it gives you within all aspects of other campaigns and you know, other information that's out there. And I think also there's a nice little, this idea of framing the financial reward as a goodwill gesture, token of appreciation is quite a nice idea, because actually if you position this correctly, you can make people realize that by having the right charging behavior, they are rewarded by making some considerable savings on the cost of running this car. And that is something you don't get by filling up the car with petrol at 4 a.m. in the morning. You probably just get some drunk by the window trying to get you to buy some cigarettes. So, you know, there's a lot to be said for being able to twist this around and turn it into a very, very positive story. We also need to use this campaign to support other measures. You know, so when people are buying an EV, link purchasing a charger with it. I mean, they often come bundled together. But again, just make it all part and parcel. Don't make it different. As I mentioned before, own advocacy is critical, so let's use that as much as we can. Now, we also need to avoid myth busting in its sort of conventional terms, which might sound a bit of an odd thing to say. And I must admit, it's something I'm always saying, oh, break down barriers, bust the myths. But actually, when you take that literally, myth busting can sometimes have the opposite effect. So if you say to someone, you know, some people think smart charging is really hard, but actually I find it really easy. The problem is, a lot of people will simply remember the fact that you said smart charging was hard. They won't remember the positive part of it. So it's very important that rather than focusing on a negative to bust a myth, we focus on the positives and actually just go forward with sort of positive, informative, easy to understand, easy to remember messages that avoid jargon and stop making this thing sound too complicated or difficult. So I think really, if you take all that into account and say this isn't the solution, but I just got a couple of slides left where I just thought, well, okay, let's pull that together. What would the objectives therefore be for these campaigns? As I say, splitting it into two, the phase one and the phase two. I think this gets us to the point. So for phase one, and that's existing EV drivers who've already got a home charge unit, the key objective of a campaign for them would be to encourage them to be one of the first to habitually smart charge at home. That's the most important thing for them. And if you like, as sort of sub-objectives, or if you like, below that secondary objectives, you know, we would need to build their awareness, understanding of smart charging and what it is and the benefits it brings. We would need to be seen ourselves as a trusted source of help and advice, or whoever is running the campaign. There would need to be some early adopter incentives, I think, to make this switching for them worthwhile. We want to encourage them to become advocates. And also, as part of the campaign, we want to make sure that the energy and charging providers are right behind it and help us by offering as many incentives and so on, and motivators, you know, for people to adopt smart charging. So that's the overall objective for phase one. For phase two, for our first time considerers, the overarching objective here, I mean, it's very simple actually, just give them the confidence that charging their EV is easy, convenient and cheap. You know, it is not a problem. We have to demystify it. We have to take down all the barriers and we have to amplify the positive messages. And then below that, we need to present, you know, the financial benefits, the convenience benefits, of charging in the right way with the right sort of tariff. And again, the information we're giving, we need to be seen as it comes from a trusted authoritative source, and reassure motorists that running their EV will work for them. So that would be the key objectives for that phase 2. So that's the end of the key things that I wanted to take you through. I mean, the last slide just talks about what the possible next steps for all this might be. So the first of these is we've got to work with the rest of this group, work with government and the wider community to develop and establish what the overall, the scope, the shape and approach of this campaign is going to be. What's our ambition? What's our scale? What are we going to try and do? Who do we want to include? There's a lot of thought and important work behind that, but establishing, and if you like, that overall sort of frame for reference is really important. We also need to think about points where we can embed smart charge information or charging information into the user journey and how this can be put into place. So everything from conversations through face-to-face at dealerships, through to people searching online, through to talking to your friend down the pub about it. We need to think about ways that whatever our campaign message is, it can also be embedded into these ongoing communication points. And we also need to think about existing campaigns that smart charging can be embedded into, because there's an awful lot out there already about electric vehicles. So, we all need to be telling the same story. At the moment, one of the things that research threw up was that there's a lot of good information out there, but people get very confused because there's also a lot of conflicting information out there. We don't want that to be the case for charging. We need everyone to be, if you like, banging the same drum, and that way we can get the message through. So that's it from me. I hope that helps. I hope you find that informative. Please do ask as many questions as you like, and we will see you on the panel shortly.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. And some thought-provoking ideas about how we might go about developing thoughts around a campaign and what that campaign is going to look like and how it's going to address things and the context with which it is incorporated. Whether there's other campaigns there and how it fits in with that, and whether it should be a government-led, industry-led activity. Right, we now come to our Q&A session, and I'm glad to see that we've got some good questions in the Q&A. And what I'd invite the panelists to prepare to answer these. I think what I'd like to start off with, and I think this is perhaps a challenge to us all to sort of think about how we respond to this, is about accessibility. One of the key things that we've said right away from the start with EVETS, it's about the EV consumer, and it's about equity. It's about ensuring that it's this electrification of transport is accessible to all, whether that be low-income groups, whether that be people with special needs, whether that be people in different parts of the country, whether it be people living in flats or in rural areas. But we had a couple of questions specifically about accessibility. And I'd really sort of like to look at that in terms of how that reflects on sources of information, segmentation, how we talk to this community, and perhaps so let's post that first, and perhaps go to our consumer behavioural specialists and ask them, in terms of accessibility, how much is that understood in the literature? I suspect with regard to charging, it's lagging, but Stephen, perhaps you'd like to sort of come back initially on what's known, or what's what knowledge there is in the research literature.
Stephen O'Neill, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I don't mind. I can jump. So yeah, it is present in literature. As I mentioned, it comes up quite a lot as an issue for individual consumers, but it's not overly well researched, in that there's quite a few organizations who do focus more so on that. So when I'm looking at the Research Institute for Disabled Consumers, and Citizens Advice do a bit of it as well, looking at it. But yeah, it's not hugely well researched, but it is out there to a small extent, but probably needs to be there much more.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'd sort of support that. I think that particularly with issues like disability, the research in relation to electric vehicles is quite limited. The one area that I've been kind of banging on about for a while is people who can't park a vehicle at home, who haven't got off-street parking, and how they get access to charging. Because Stephen O'Neill was talking about how, in the data that we have from charging studies, the preferred location for charging for most people who have an EV currently is at their own home. And 30% of households can't do that because they don't have the off-street parking that would enable it. So we at the Energy Systems Catapult did some research about a year ago, looking at what kinds of charging solutions might enable people who don't have off-street parking to even consider an EV as a viable proposition for them, and what kinds of charging solutions might be helpful. And I think OZEV have currently commissioned some follow-on research to look at that. But that's a quite pressing issue if we think strategically about rolling out EVs across the whole of the UK. If 30% of households don't think they're practical, which was one of the findings of our study, because they've got nowhere to charge them. So that's a pressing issue that I think the community as a whole needs to engage with.
Yeah,
that's
a good point.
Back up on that, sorry, Jonathan. I think that's a very fair point, in that they're probably the most under-researched group. Obviously, there's not an awful lot of research on, say, disabled consumers and stuff like that, but given it's 30% of the population, apart from the study Stephen cited and the upcoming OZEV stuff, there really is not much more on the preferences of those who don't have access at home, or who will not have access at home.
Okay, and of course, if we want to get to this position where we are going to electrify all cars and vans, we need to make that accessible to all sectors of the community. Bridget, from the EVA England's perspective, what's your exposure to this?
Yes, I just wanted to say how important those issues are. And I absolutely echo Stephen's point. It is really important for people without driveways, and working around how and the best ways of making that accessible. And obviously there's a lot of activity happening in this area now, both led by OZEV and also from particular businesses and the local authorities. But it is really important also to level up the charge point provision across the country. As far as accessibility in terms of access by disabled drivers, I think Motability, as well as the other work that's been referred to, have done some very good work on this area and are continuing this work, and will be taking a lot of that forward with other organisations in that space. And I think across the other countries of the UK, I think the more that EV drivers make their voices heard through associations, and also highlight any differences that there may be in their experience. So we do end up with a uniformly good provision. It would be obviously very desirable.
Right. Thank you. So I think one of the key things we've come up there is that there's more work to be done, and what we do need to do is to make sure that that we break down the barriers for all sectors of the community, whatever barriers they face in being able to access electric vehicles and charging. I'd like now to go to a point which I know has been an issue in terms of the complaints procedures and the processes and the journey. And that's a question we've had around, well, it's actually in relationship to the survey that was posted in the chat, a survey which is being promoted by or supported by Innovate, but is looking at EV bundles and of course those with energy switchers. And I think I would like to ask Sarah Chisnell, how do we address this from in terms of when things go wrong and things do go wrong, how do we respond, and what lessons have we learned from looking at the consumer journey workshops? Sarah, you're on mute.
You would think after 15 months of using webinars, I'd have got it sorted by now. Forgive me. Yes, on the surface, that sounds like a very easy question about the lessons learned, but I think I think people are realizing how complicated some of this is going to be for consumers. I think to start with, and it does link to your accessibility issue as well, we need to keep things simple. And of course, bundling services is not going to be a simple process for most consumers. But we need to keep things simple because things will go wrong. So back to we need independent, accessible information and advice in the first place so that people are really clear about what it is they're getting themselves into. We need some consistent industry-wide standards about how we treat customers and what they can expect. We do need to make sure that people have access to redress when things go wrong, because as you've just said, things are going to go wrong. And we also need proper consumer advocacy, which is obviously there's a number of organisations who do that. In terms of, we are seeing almost weekly, I'm sure it's actually happening daily, we're seeing bundled energy packages being provided to consumers. So some of those are obviously being initiated by energy suppliers who are offering consumers deals to switch their energy supply to them, and it may come with a great tariff either for roaming using public chargers or obviously most commonly at the moment for their home charging. We're also seeing car dealerships offering bundled packages. And there is no easy answer to this because obviously many of these are unregulated services. So your energy supply, your smart meter, your tariff, and any issues to do with billing, all of those things are part of the regulated energy sector. And Ombudsman Services is the organisation where you can't get things put right with negotiations with your supplier, you would eventually come to us. But we're obviously now seeing lots of complaints starting to come in where people have taken on one of these bundled service packages, if you like, which will make complete sense to most people. I'm an EV driver and have been for 7 years, and I'm now seeing them coming in. Sadly, I can't access them either because, like Jason, I still don't have a smart meter. And there's no sign of when that will be rolled out. And that, I think you're absolutely right to bring that up. And also as regards accessibility, that point we were just talking about, if you don't have a smart meter, there are a lot of things you simply cannot access, which you should be able to. So that's a big job for government to get that sorted. But on the bundled front, at the moment, we're looking at, obviously, that the group that I've been working with, that Citizens Advice led on, we obviously looked at that journey on the complaint side. And I'll be honest, we didn't come up with any really simple solutions. We identified a number of key issues, one of which was obviously the information point and making sure people are very clear about their terms and conditions, the T&Cs. And of course, many of us don't read those. When we sign up to a deal, how many of us go through every page of our mobile phone contract that we're asked to sign when we take up a new deal? I know I don't. And I actually work for Ombudsman Services, who also do a telecommunications Ombudsman service. So we're going to have to make sure that suppliers are being much more upfront about those T's and C's. We're going to have to make sure that information is made very, very accessible and independently about what bundling actually means. So what does it mean when you decide to have a bundle package, which is your EV home energy, and it's also your roaming subscription energy for public chargers, making sure people actually understand what it is they're getting into. It means that billing is going to have to be much more clear. And we know how many issues we get into on billing, and we've been trying to solve this for decades now. within Ombudsman Services, we've so far been taking the view that if you get into a bundle with a regulated energy service, we then treat that, the whole bundle, as a regulated energy service. But that's because we're making that decision to do it. We need to make sure that BEI and Ofgem are fully aware of that and are happy to support that. But our view is if you come to us saying that your tariff, you haven't been able to sort your tariff out, and it's because of your smart meter, your tariff and your smart meter are both regulated energy issues. So the Energy Ombudsman should take that on. It may be that it's connected to your EV, but they're still regulated energy. So at the moment, it's very much case by case. And we're obviously, just like EVETS, trying to work with BEIS to make sure that we're actually looking at consumer protection in the round. Because obviously it's not just going to be about EVs. This is almost the tip of the iceberg. And as we move into connected homes and smart homes and all the appliances we could be looking at, we need to make sure that people are equipped to do that. And there's a big job to be done, as Jason's just been telling us with the public information campaign. So I wish I could give an easy answer, but at the moment I would certainly say to everybody here, if you take a bundle product that includes a regulated energy product, then it should be treated like a regulated energy product, which of course comes with mandatory ADR provision. And so everybody who has an issue with a regulated energy package should get mandated ADR from Ombudsman Services if their case is held up to be legitimate.
ADR, can you just explain that for the audience?
Sorry, it's alternative dispute resolution. So basically what we try to do in the ADR sector is offer a form of resolving a problem, putting things back to how they were before things went wrong, without people having to resort to the courts. And so there are a number of industries and sectors right now which are regulated and have to provide what we call mandatory ADR. And obviously the energy sector is one and the telecom sector is another. There have always been discussions about what other industries should have to provide mandatory ADR. And of course, one of the biggest discussions at the moment is there's actually no mandatory alternative dispute resolution for your car right now. So although lots and lots of car manufacturers sign up to voluntary codes, there's no actual legal obligation for them to help you sort your problem out. So that the motor ombudsman runs a very good ADR scheme, but it's up to the dealerships and the car manufacturers to voluntarily sign up to that. Whereas energy companies right now have to sign up to the Ombudsman Service ADR, which of course is free to the consumer. And again, in terms of accessibility, that's another issue as well. We shouldn't be putting people in a position where to seek redress, they have to pay for that service. We're already going to be asking people to take on a lot of extra expense, particularly in the early days. And so that to us is a very important principle, that it's free to the consumer.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. And I think it's well recognised that this is a space that needs to be looked at in detail. And I believe the government are starting a review of the consumer protections in this space, which is
they are indeed
needed. And now I want to go and switch on. We had a question around terminology. And sort of pointing out that for some time we've had economy selling, we've had off-peak charging or off-peak electricity. Should we be using smart charging as terminology? Should we be using existing terminology? Does smart charging represent a value-added benefit to talk about, or is there does that open the way for disbenefits or poor perception? I think I'm going to first of all pose this to Jason to sort of come back on, but I'll also be interested in Stephen Skippon's view as well. So Jason, smart charging, is it a benefit? Should we be using it as a terminology, or should we be using the existing terminology?
Cheers, John. Yeah, no, don't use it. It's too confusing. It's just charging. We just, as we were saying before, I think people are, there's enough confusion already amongst consumers, consumers who haven't had an EV yet. And I think if you introduce smart charging, that's to them another level, another tier. And as we were saying earlier, by default, all charging will become smart. I mean, whether you adopt the behaviour is, I suppose, another matter. But the hardware, the tariffs, they'll all become smart. It's just charging. Keep it as simple as possible.
So how do you get people to adopt behaviour and the habit formation if you not, without using a snappy term for what you're talking about?
Because I think they need to understand that charging by default has these, if you like, this intelligent to it. I don't think we need that. I don't think they would worry about whether it's smart or dumb charging. It's just charging, which you can do in an efficient and economical way if you choose to do so. And unfortunately, it's usually money rather than anything else that motivates people. So they, if you make people aware that you can charge your car for a third of the price if you do it between 4 and 6 a.m., then a lot of people will think that's fine for me. I think we just need to keep it simple. That would be my view.
Okay, Stephen.
I always think whenever we're thinking about what to call things that we're going to put in front of consumers, the best way to find out what to call them is to ask consumers. So that's what I do. I think it seems well, sure, but that's the whole point. You need to ask, and you'll get a variety of different answers from different people who have different perspectives. And I think then you as organisations, you make choices about what you call things based on what you know about how they'll impact on consumers. So that's always my approach to what you call things. In terms of, is it a benefit? Is smart charging a benefit? Then it is if people use it. So the types of benefits that you can have are, obviously you can reduce costs, and for people who get a kind of effective emotional benefit from using energy that's greener, that's lower carbon, then you can get that kind of benefit from it. So there are a bunch of different benefits that and different benefits will appeal to different people. That's the whole idea of segmentation. So yeah, I think that it's definitely the case that that smart charging in one form or another will have benefits to offer to to quite a few segments of the population. People who may not benefit are those who, for instance, one of the reasons why they charge when they get home after work is they want to use the vehicle again quite soon afterwards. So that people who are therefore not able to plug in for significantly longer than it takes to do the next.
Yeah.
So if they're not able to provide that kind of flexibility, then their opportunity to benefit.
Okay, thank you. That's just reminded me, sort of asking the consumer ask people what they referred to things. Terminology came up when we were doing our research into information sources. And I know we sort of tested, Lorraine and you were involved along with Rosie at EST, and I don't know if Alejandra, you were directly involved in that, but I know you did a number of Google searches on terminologies, and you got very different results depending on what you were searching on. Do you want to sort of comment on some of those findings?
Yeah, exactly. As you say, we used Google Trends, as I mentioned, to use different words to work out what was popular, what were consumers using, what terminology. So then we could get more hits, or more realistic hits about what consumers were seeing. But I know that Energy Saving Trust went on and did a number of focus groups and a bit of research, and wrote a report about all of their findings. So I don't know if Alejandra can expand on that.
Yeah, our focus groups that wasn't really in the scope of our focus groups. Asking kind of what they prefer was more around just their perceptions around smart charging and consumer advice. But we did find that even though the focus groups were kind of segmented between those who had zero experience with EVs at all and those who had some experience before or were EV drivers, And throughout all three groups, whenever we talked about smart charging, there was a lot of confusion, even in the most experienced of groups. So I do think that there's just a lot of kind of confusion about what that means. So I kind of tend to agree that I don't know that that's the best terminology from a consumer perspective, because there was just a lot of confusion even with smart meters. Like, is that the same thing? And yeah.
Yeah, and I know there's a tendency of us in the industry starting to talk about SMETS 1 and SMETS 2 meters, and I mentioned that to my family. They all look at me like I'm mad. Okay, we've had a couple of questions around technology, which I think is probably the wrong working group really there to pose that question. We've had some questions about hydrogen and also about AC and DC charging. And you know, there's certainly technical groups within the task force would be much more appropriate. But I think what I'd do to perhaps go around the table and get a view of the perception of smart charging was seen as something, sort of a necessity, absolutely a necessity. If you're going to have, it was to paper over the cracks that the first generation of EVs charged slowly and it took a long time to charge. Now we're getting rapid and fast and rapid charging. Now we're getting vehicles with huge batteries and range in them. What does this do to the smart charging necessity or what we're talking about? What are these challenges? Are they benefits? How do we respond to that? And let's start with Bridget, as a representative of EV England and EV drivers, what's your perception or your members' perception of how things are going to go forward and what are really going to be the critical things?
Well, I mean, there's a whole number of critical issues, if you like, which are going forward, firstly, as a result of the OZEV consultation that's just happened recently on consumer experience. So I think that those are being addressed around data, access to data, 24-hour helplines, clear kilowatt hours on charge posts. I think reliability is really important to people. And accessibility, so all of which were addressed in the recent OZEV consultation, and we're very, very hopeful that those are going to be enacted and taken forward as fast as possible, because then I think it'll be much easier to say to people that actually this is it's not such a daunting prospect, the complexity that's out there. I think on the charging infrastructure, I think there have been great improvements even in the last year and even since the phase out announcement in November. And obviously there's further improvements that can be made, but actually there's a good case to continuing to persuade people to adopt EVs because, as you say, already the range anxiety with the new vehicles is just, the discussion is really, doesn't need to be there. And also because the charge point network is so much more extensive. Obviously, there's work in progress and there are more charge points needed in particular parts of the country, and there will be more charge points needed as we approach 2030 and the numbers increase. On smart charging, I think the early adopters are also a mixed segmented group of people, and some will be very, very happy around all of this, and others maybe less so. But I think also the case to the wider public, given the interest in sustainability, given COP this year, that actually, as Stephen Skippon mentioned, obviously price is one factor in smart charging, but the other thing is that the argument that it's really going to help keep electricity prices down and it can make a big difference to our sustainable energy in this country, I think quite a lot of people will be persuaded by that. So I guess those are my comments.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I'm realising we're running out of time. That's a great perspective from the consumer side. Stephen O'Neill from the Ofgem, the energy sector side, are you looking at this as a positive thing or with trepidation? What's your gut feel?
Kind of both. So first of all, yes, it is a necessity now. Whether it was before or not, probably was already, but it 100% is now when it comes to smart charging. From an engineering Ofgem perspective, it is probably trepidation and a bit of a problem. But it also, from the consumer side of it, the fact that the EVs can be charged faster, the fact that there's bigger loads, offers opportunities for benefits for individuals to actually engage. So yes, from an engineering side, it's probably a bit more trepidation, but there's now more opportunity for benefit for the individual consumer, which you would hope we could translate into engagement from that consumer. That is the very short answer, considering we have.
That is a great short answer. And apologies to the other panelists, I'm not going to be able to come to you for a final comment. So I think we're now into our wrap up. So what I would like to say to our audience, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you found it informative. I hope you've got an understanding of where we've been working and what we've been doing around consumer engagement and those specific elements about information, about the complaints journey, about understanding consumer behaviour, and about how to look at this together in terms of providing advice on how to structure a campaign. You can find more information about the EV Energy Taskforce from our portal, which is www.evenergytaskforce.com, so very difficult to remember. Equally, you can contact us there, and if you have any outstanding questions, please do contact us. And with that, I'd like to close and say thank you to my panelists and our presenters for doing a marvellous job, and thank you to the audience for joining us, and also thank you to Green TV for running us through this. Thank you very much, everybody.